To this, the final event in our Writers and Scholars series. Glad to be here. I sat down to think about this introduction, and I thought, well, this is a real privilege and an honor. And I thought he probably wishes I'd just sit down and be quiet. It's really hard to know what to say when you're introducing someone who is as modest and as private as my colleague, Professor Steve Guthrie. I decided against giving you a couple of very finely crafted paragraphs telling you what to think. And instead, I'm going to just tell you some of the things I know about him, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions. So here goes. Professor Guthrie, before he was a professor, was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. He worked construction for 10 years before earning a PhD at Brown. In the late 80s, he was a founding member of and chief publicist for a fledgling softball team that played in what is now known as the Science Squad. He and I may be the only ones who remember that. He has been active in the living wage campaign for decades. He helped start the Ray of Light Fund to address staff members' urgent financial needs. He helped develop an English language class for staff whose first language is not English. He is a fiercely and appropriately proud grandfather of Isabel and William James. Stephen. His middle name is Stephen?
William
James. He has a finely tuned sense of the absurd. He's a poet, and he used to teach poetry writing at the college. He was singularly influential in diversifying the curriculum of the English department at Agnes Scott. As chair, he led the department through a much-needed curricular revision. He is a model liberal arts teacher, which means for me that his learning is comprehensive and he is dedicated to undergraduate education. Since arriving at Agnes Scott in 1985, he has taught courses in Chaucer, Dante, the history of the English language, medieval romance, introduction to poetry writing, introduction to literature and composition, perspectives on literature, British literature to 1700. But this list, however impressive, is misleading because he has also developed such courses as the English language and its discontents, social forces in the detective novel, American Indian literature, Getting Medieval, a first-year seminar in Chicago, and the craft of writing with themes like surviving the American dream. And I can argue that one can see a similar pattern in his publications. His early titles include Prosody and the Study of Chaucer, a generative reply to Paul Kaiser. Thank you. Babcock's Curve and the Problem of Chaucer's Final E. Shall and Will in Troilus and Cressida. Dialogics and Prosody in Chaucer, and many more. But more recently, he has written essays with titles like these. That's So Medieval. Medievalism and Orientalism. Torture, Inquisition, Medievalism, Reality TV. And of course, the intriguing title of tonight's talk. Time Travel, Pulp Fictions, and Changing Attitudes Toward the Middle Ages. Why you can't get Renaissance on somebody's ass. Please join me in welcoming Professor Steve Guthrie.
Usually the editors or someone in the publisher's office complains about the politics in the things that I write. This time with this one, which was published a year ago, the main thing they didn't like was the contractions. They took out all of them, and I had to fight for the one in the title, but I won that. Before I start, I'll get the footnotes out of the way. Just got two of them. First, this is a shortened version of an essay that was published a year ago and that I wrote a year before that. In just that short span of 2 years, it has become clearer that the national mood sketched in the essay is probably incurable, and that its source is the growing awareness that peak oil production has come and gone, not just for the U.S., but for the globe. The insane levels of greed, the absurd income gaps, the bunker mentality, the fortified Walton family compound in Bentonville, Arkansas, white America's fantasy of a demographic apocalypse, the total corruption of the electoral process. It does sound pretty absurd. All of these belong to the steep downslope of the oil production curve. And not even a more and more desperate enforcement of the Carter Doctrine will solve that problem. The Carter Doctrine, a cornerstone of American foreign policy since the late 1970s, the doctrine that the world's oil supplies are to America's strategic interest and that we'll defend our access to them militarily. And by this, of course, we mean access on our terms. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population and uses half of its energy. The level of comfort that depends on this level of consumption will now irreversibly decline. Footnote 2. Except in quotes, I'll use only non-gendered personal pronouns in this reading. The idea comes from my English language course this spring. Colloquial English has used ungendered pronouns for indefinite constructions for centuries. Each person must decide for themselves in order to avoid the masculine generic. And in the last 40 years, various systems have been tried for definite constructions. Most of these have either phonetic or grammatical drawbacks, but a system proposed by Gayatri Spivak seems promising. I'm going to try out a variation on that system, one that's interesting to me because it dates back more than 900 years. The object is to create a system that can apply universally, so it differs in a couple of ways from the current use of plural pronouns in the queer community. I'll add that my knowledge of current patterns of innovation comes mostly from people in the class, so it has been a teachable moment for the teacher, something that you can't afford to pass up. This is the latest and the last in a series of essays on modern uses of the Middle Ages. Earlier pieces studied things like popular internet usage and the rhetoric of American foreign policy. This one looks at how a few real and imaginary medievalists have seen the period. In one earlier essay, I argued that popular medievalism is the temporal counterpart of Edward Said's Orientalism. In other words, the present sees in the past as the West sees in the East, the image of its own repressed desires, so that the Middle Ages, like Kipling's country, somewheres east of Suez, becomes both despicably barbarous and alluringly exotic to the modern eye. Post 9/11, the two notions often overlapped. Network correspondents in Afghanistan were shocked and delighted to say how medieval the place was. And dispatches from Iraq always gawked at the medieval state-sponsored torture chambers. Back home, we had a phrase that swept away anything repugnantly obsolete, called it so medieval. We also had Disneyfied versions of King Arthur and the Round Table and the Grail, but these we call transcendent images. The real Middle Ages was violence, oppression, ignorance, disease, and filth. Sketches of the period always dwelled on the horrible smelliness of the place. This temporal medievalism argument is intuitive to a medievalist, and it's hard to resist as a diagnostic tool. If something's called medieval, it's sure to be something we resist in ourselves, generally on moral grounds. And that analysis worked pretty well up until a few years ago. My argument here is that the balance of the ambivalence has tipped, and that academics have been slow to see the change because we still have a stake in the Renaissance-based model of the world that created the Orientalist medievalist attitude in the first place. Dick Cheney's motto, "Sometimes we have to go over to the dark side," makes a convenient milepost. Popular usage still associates medieval with physical violence and the absence of centralized, organized authority, but it no longer resists these things as it wants to. The Renaissance model of the modern world, with its twin myths of inevitable progress in the dominant nation state, a model that saw itself as the cure for the Middle Ages, is giving way to a model identified with the Middle Ages: the weak state, corporate feudalism, personal insecurity, and physical trial. An essential piece of this model is the acceptance of unregulated violence as a real possibility and even a creative force. We are told that we can no longer expect the stability of permanent employment, the security of the welfare state, or the promise of upward mobility, but we're told that these losses are opportunities for the strong and resourceful. For the not so strong, the advice is to labor uncomplaining, cleave to family and church, and prepare to defend ourselves. The telling image of the television season, well, this was 2 years ago, but it's still there, is a portable home gym called The Rack, an overturned Zimmer frame on rollers, advertised incessantly on cable channels. 20 years ago, medieval images and advertising were the physical suffering to be avoided by buying the product. Now the suffering is the product. In the study of popular attitudes toward the Middle Ages, historical fiction is an obvious place to look, and time travel fiction is especially attractive because its goal is to bring modern senses and moral responses into contact with the medieval world in ways that normal historical fiction can't. The genre is small. There's Twain's Connecticut Yankee, Daphne du Maurier's The House on the Strand, and Connie Willis's Doomsday Book, which is the most substantial of the recent novels. But the medieval fantasy of the generation is Michael Crichton's Timeline, which was a Times bestseller, and then a Richard Donner film with an exploding castle and some very nice wallowing doll. In Crichton's novel, the modern world is a technological nightmare whose best hopes are disinterested academic research and self-regulating capitalism to support it. The medieval world is physically violent and politically chaotic, but these qualities are seen as a creative dynamism. The dislocations of an unstable world are opportunities for the strong and resourceful. The two main themes of the novel are also the two main virtues of its version of the 14th century. It provides the model for technological capitalism, and therefore for the modern world, and it offers a home to the chivalric spirit. The first of these is grafted onto the action-adventure plot of the film in order to establish the relevance of the medieval setting. The second, chivalry, is essential to the plot but discordant with the setting. The only character in the novel who believes in the chivalric spirit is one of the modern academic time travelers. The two themes together make an odd match, and the tension between them is interesting, and I'll return to that point in a moment. The cast of characters in the novel is basic melodrama. There's an evil, has anybody read Timeline or seen the film? There's an evil billionaire physicist, entrepreneur, amateur historian called Doniger, whose practical interest in the Middle Ages is a scheme to create authentic medieval theme parks, remember that, on real medieval sites. And there are here victims, an archaeologist, an experimental historian, with so-called in the novel, with an interest in martial arts, and two graduate students. The railroad track Haytaizen to is the Dordogne in 1357, on the eve of a French-English battle. The plot is their struggle to survive and the efforts of others to rescue them after the time machine blows up. On one hand, the 14th century of Timeline is predictably dangerous, violent, unstable, and smelly. Quote, it was a world of shifting boundaries and shifting alliances, often changing from one day to the next. It was a world of death, of sweeping plagues, of disease, of constant warfare, unquote. Dirt, physical cruelty, and vermin are the tag images of the medieval world, here as in most places. And this says something about the social register of the novel and about its intended audience. If you see a rat or an instrument of torture and think medieval, then your experience of the present is limited. From time to time, the moderns do have their prejudices shaken. Medieval people are surprisingly clean, they find. They wipe their butts with strips of white linen. But for the most part, the Middle Ages is a place where women and strong survive. On the other hand, quoting, the truth was that the modern world was invented in the Middle Ages. and here the modern world means a market economy and the accumulation of capital to run it. Villages were built by entrepreneurs as fortified shopping malls. Mills were run efficiently as chartered monopolies, and mercenaries with advanced weapons changed warfare and finished off the warrior knight. Crichton's overview of medieval economics helps explain the travelers and the novelist's interest in the period, but it isn't directly reflected in the action-adventure plot. The mill blows up without a glance at its balance sheet. A lot of things blow up in the novel, and even more in the film. And the central battle between baronial armies is over territory, not markets. Within the novel, then, medieval capitalism isn't a text for the modern world to learn from. What it is, however, is an authority, a point of origin, a validation for the modern world, and a development of obvious relevance to the modern world. What it emphatically isn't is a glimmer of the Renaissance. The novel describes the genealogy of modernity, and the line goes directly from the feudal world to us, bypassing the Renaissance completely. And the novel makes the link between medieval and modern worlds without reference to a theory of progress. Modern economics sprang more or less full-grown from advances made under, not in spite of, the feudal system. Crichton insists that the difference between the 14th and 20th centuries is not one of progress, but this doesn't seem to reflect a dystopian view of the present. It seems rather to indicate simply an abandonment of the Renaissance as our point of origin. Significantly, the concept of the nation-state is also missing from the novel. In the medieval setting, British and French armies are under baronial control, but with no mention of any higher allegiance. The political system is headless feudalism. No kings are involved or even mentioned. In the novel's modern setting, and it shifts back and forth between the 21st and the 14th century. In the novel's modern setting, the state is invisible and irrelevant. The situation in both worlds is unstable, and instability is risk but also opportunity. The keys to success are personal initiative, fortification, and efficiency, private enterprise, decentralized economic feudalism. Among the moderns, the evil Doniger embodies the excesses of the entrepreneurial spirit. But here vice is here cynical disrespect for human life, not your economics. And the book never suggests that the one is a function of the other. The way to solve a problem like Doniger isn't to call in the police or the FBI or the FTC or the State Department, and no one does. As far as the novel is concerned, there is no State Department. The solution, after Doniger tries to cut your losses by leaving the time travelers to die in the past, is for your two senior officers to decide that, hey, it's gone too far, and to ship him to 1348, the eve of the major outbreak of the plague, without hope of return. Explaining that, quoting, "There have been some discussions, Bob. We think someone more moderate should run the company now," unquote. By the implicit morality of the novel, this is an appropriate solution. They get medieval on your ass in order to save the baronial power of the corporation. They don't get Renaissance on your ass by calling in a federal agency to work them over. What we're left with is a brief for a self-policing corporate feudalism with the intelligence and good taste to fund academic research because it provides entrepreneurial opportunities, and the good business sense to deal decisively with a serious liability, the CEOs on amok. And the innocent academics in the novel have no problem with this model. The archaeologist, called Professor Johnston, points out that corporate funding is the way of the modern world. Hay never argues that government should fund research. Again, for the purpose of the novel, there is no government. And Hay tries to avoid an interview with a muckraking French journalist because, quoting, "She's one of those conspiracy people. Capitalism is bad. All corporations are evil," end quote. An article by Jenny Adams argues that, quote, "By the end of the story, the academic characters, the decided heroes of the tale, have triumphed over corporate greed, the influence of the market, and the evil of capitalism," unquote. But that's an academic person rooting for the side. The novel says otherwise. The professor never changes your views or rejects your source of funding, and your outlook is echoed by the other characters and by the narrative voice. The implication is that with Doniger gone, the system is functional again. So, the ideological platform of the novel is morally self-regulated corporate feudalism, as patron to academic research. The trick is achieving moral regulation in a world without a relevant state. And the answer Timeline tries to offer is the chivalric ethic. The cracks in this model begin with the medieval setting. Crichton needs the mid-14th century for its economic developments, and that forces him to accept the autumn of the knightly code. The medieval characters in the novel were notably unchivalrous. So Hay imports the chivalric spirit from the modern world in the historian called Merrick, an authority on medieval warfare, and Merrick's foil, grad student Chris. The most predictable stress line this creates is in the novel's treatment of gender roles. As they learn to survive a physical crisis, the travelers also learn that concessions to late 20th century feminism can only carry a popular novel so far. Survival is by rule a gendered occupation. Grad student Chris starts the trip with a weak stomach and a lack of enthusiasm, but near the end of the novel, he saves a fair maiden by slaying a large and smelly knight, from tooth decay, in a single combat at a place called the Green Chapel, of course. The 14th century makes a man at that moment. Grad student Kate, the architect of the group, is fit, strong, brave, and gymnastic enough to escape from villains in the rafters of the castle, but it's Hay whom Chris rescues from the smelly knight, and her response, only half mocking, is, "My hero." Hay is still the stronger and braver, but Hay learns to act like a proper lady in a romance novel. The real hero for Crichton is historian Merrick, who has always longed to test himself physically against the real Middle Ages. In the most fantasy-driven thread of the book, Hay survives a tournament, defeats trained knights in battle, wins the heart of a local, Lady Clare, and stays behind to live the rest of her life in the 14th century, as a knight, of course, not as a peasant. Merrick's sports fantasy is narrated with occasional hints of narrative shame. For example, we're asked to accept that your victories in jousting are credible on the ground that Hay himself is aware that they aren't credible. Your signal quality is that Hay believes in and relentlessly practices the forms of chivalry defined by grad student Chris as, quote, honor and truth and the purity of the body, the defense of women, the sanctity of true love, and all the rest of it, unquote. All the rest of it being Merrick's main interests, hand-to-hand combat in courtly manners. What's strange is that Hay is the only character in the novel who does believe in these things. It isn't that Hay learns the ethic from the Middle Ages. Hay learned it from books. It isn't even that the medievals learn it from him. They don't. The novel champions Merrick, but finds no authority for him in the 14th century except a vague nostalgia, also a modern import, for an even earlier, less technological age, which the medievals are too busy looking for technological advantage to indulge. So, the image of chivalry hovers over the novel, but it's never anchored there. It reinforces the ethic of physical competition that underlies the novel's socio-political views, and it reminds the audience that a strong dose of the medieval can be a testosterone high and a survival tool. The novel also suggests, by juxtaposing Merrick's heroism with Donninger's villainy, that the chivalric ethic can be a moral antidote to modern cynicism and a self-regulating principle for modern economic life. In MBA speak, the offerer of a friendly lion is called a white knight, and the robber baron myth of the entrepreneur's knight errant still permeates corporate culture where it survives as a sports fantasy like Merrick's or Crichton's. But if this is the intention, chivalry is the conscience of the economic system, then it's an act of desperation on Crichton's part. In the novel's medieval world, chivalry is on the way out. And in the modern world, chivalry is no match for advanced capitalism, the cure for Donninger's and unfriendly takeover, and a one-way trip to the plague years. And it's no source of research funding. Even as a remedy for Merrick's nostalgia, chivalry is suspect. In the end, Hay escapes modernity, but is left in a world Hay has already described as essentially modern and morally vacant. So in the end, the theme of chivalry cancels itself out, leaving both worlds exposed to the present practical dangers of an ungoverned economic system. A popular novel must resonate with the fears and daydreams of its audience, and these resonances are clear. The Middle Ages are us, a perilous world of unregulated economic forces where the mirage of knightly honor is our best moral. From a market expected, the ill-fitting theme of chivalry is just the popular genre of medieval romance asserting itself. But that's the point. Timeline replicates and finances a current daydream combining entrepreneurial capitalism, chivalric honor, physical prowess, and old-fashioned gender roles. It also replicates a daydream in which the world can be sketched through the actions of elites. The modern setting is academic and management-level corporate. The medievals with speaking parts are people in positions of power fighting to get more power. Everyone else is a bit player, and the reader can either identify with the powerful or watch carefully and look for places to hide. The structures of class, gender, and sexuality are assumed, and race, in the modern sense of the term, is not an issue. There is, however, one recent time travel fiction in which race and class are very much the issue. The Gil Younger, Martin Lawrence comic film, Black Knight. The film is a farce, but then timeline is no tragedy, and in some ways Black Knight digs deeper into the tensions of the modern world. Lawrence plays Jamal Skywalker, a low-wage employee of a crumbling medieval theme park in Los Angeles, a neighborhood business threatened by a newer, fancier corporate franchise operation next door. At the point of quitting your dead-end job, he falls into the moat while cleaning it and surfaces by a medieval riverbank. Pranks and pratfalls follow, but your time in the past gives him courage to return to the present, where he helps save the business and therefore the neighborhood. Laurie Fink and Martin Shifter, medievalists, argue that the film uses, quote, the experience of the Middle Ages to relieve the trauma of urban modernity, unquote, and that although Junger plays the juxtaposition of settings for laughs, here, quote, medieval England does not seem as alien to America's inner cities as it first appears. Fink and Schiffman emphasize the physicality of kinship. Quote, even as we live in the body, we necessarily live in the Middle Ages, unquote. As usual, phrases like urban modernity, inner cities, and the body are code for race and class. So in this formula, for medievalists Fink and Schiffman, black and poor equals medieval. They argue that Lawrence's character turns the Middle Ages as dumping ground formula on its head, using the skills of the modern ghetto dweller to survive the medieval world and teach it a thing or three. Dancing, of course, chivalry. Jamal befriends a disillusioned knight and restores his faith in chivalric values, and especially justice. Quoting again, he struggles to reimpose the very sort of centralized, organized, and just governance missing from his inner city experience, unquote. In the end, after returning to the present, Jamal inspires the staff to save the park, bail out the local woman who owns it, and bring hope to the neighborhood. Fink and Schiffman argue that Hay succeeds by tapping her capacity for cultural hybridity, and that the film's conclusion fails by suppressing that hybridity in favor of the capitalist happy ending. Here, though, is the problem. Their interpretation makes sense, but only from an academic viewpoint lodged in race and class-based codes and Renaissance-based myths. Lawrence's character is a clown and a bridger of culture gaps, but Hay is also, at one key point, a committed militant, and Hay doesn't really believe in the principle of centralized authority that Fink and Schiffman take to be the source of justice. Why would Hay? In the medieval setting, and in the modern one too, Hay does help restore a rightful queen to the throne, but from her viewpoint, He is helping a ragtag group of citizens to seize power from illegitimate rule by any means necessary. And her rallying cry to a dispirited band of medievals raises the ghost of Rodney King, quoting from him, sometimes we can't just get along. Sometimes we gotta take up arms. Look, hear what I'm saying. Your lives are shitty. I know because I've been there. Unquote. This is kind of a radical moment in the film, and it's a caution to liberal political moralism. Centralized and organized don't necessarily produce just. It isn't hard to argue that what's wrong with our inner cities is that they're ours. They're victims of organized government, tyrannical, inept, and without the prospect of home rule. And it isn't hard to argue that the conclusion of the film, with Jamal saving the theme park for its employees, the neighborhood, and the black woman who owns it, but saving it as a collective enterprise, is also a radical act, which doesn't retreat from hybridity, but extends it in a direction that puts food on the table. Extend this sentiment to the country as a whole when you have the present near universal disaffection with standard political parties, presidency, Congress, the courts, and the liberal arts. Among the poor, it's a disillusionment born of long experience. Among the rich and their followers, it tends to be a conviction that the old machinery of the state is outmoded, and that the correctives are individual freedom, economic deregulation, entrepreneurial spirit, and physical fortitude. This is the popular mood, and it accounts for the shifting ground of popular medievalism. There's also within it a basic contradiction between the currents of populism and monopolism that helps account for the violent anxieties of the movement. The project for the coming decades will be to resolve or accept the contradiction. In hindsight, the emblematic line of Renaissance-centered 20th century America was G. Gordon Lidgett's when asked why Hay had followed Nixon's illegal orders. Quote, "When the prince commands, the proper response is fiat voluntas tua." The emblematic lines of medieval-centered 21st century America are Dick Cheney's. Sometimes you have to go to the dark side. And of course, Marcellus Wallace's in Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, "I'ma get medieval on your ass." Tarantino's one-liner, like Junger's film, brings race and class into the picture in ways that are keys to an understanding of changes in popular mood. Pulp Fiction springs almost entirely from Tarantino's mental film archive, and yet the Ving Rhames Marcellus Wallace line has taken the pulse of the country. Carolyn Dinshaw, in her well-known critique of the sexuality in the film, argues that the medieval world, as evoked in Pulp Fiction and in popular usage generally, quoting from Dinshaw, is the space of the rejects, really the abjects of the world. He sees the medieval as representing, quote, things that cannot be eradicated. And he writes of Tarantino's, quote, fascination with the immoral, unquote. The two concepts overlap. The ineradicable is the immoral. These are the things we resist in ourselves on moral grounds. For Dinshaw, getting medieval, in the popular sense, is a matter of, quote, undertaking brutal private vengeance in a triumphal and unregulated bloodbath, unquote, which Dinshaw deplores. But here again is the problem, as if a regulated bloodbath would be preferable. But isn't that just what we've had on a global scale in the 15 years since Dinshaw's book was written? The war on Iraq and Afghanistan has been a well-funded bloodbath regulated by the dominant nation state that protects us. The activities at Abu Ghraib, medieval torture chambers in Iraq but with Americans in charge, were regulated by the Pentagon's chain of command. They were dressed up to look medieval, and the torturers may have thought they were getting medieval on some Iraqi asses, but the episode was well orchestrated by Washington. It was getting Renaissance all the way. For many in this country, the revelation that these activities were centralized and organized was shocking. For others with a wider experience of the present, they were business as usual. Marcellus Wallace's revenge is not explicitly sexual, and popular uses of get medieval and similar phrases are rarely sexual. But as Dinshaw argues, the phrase associates itself with a pattern of anxious anality that runs throughout the main threads of the film. Dinshaw sees Tarantino as coining the phrase in order to stabilize the film's sexuality, to keep the modern world safe from unambiguous white heterosexuality. Against this project, he argues for Foucault's vision of, quote, a realm of clearly apprehensible acts and regular surfaces, unquote. That is, for uninterpreted sexuality, and by extension, uninterpreted identity in general, a notion for which Foucault found authority in the Middle Ages. Dinshaw offers what he calls a subversive definition and strategy for ridding the world medieval of what he calls its negative moral connotations. Quote, quoting Dinshaw, getting medieval, dash, playing in an abjected space, adopting an abjected role, doubly gets at the impossibility of absolute straightness, whiteness, modernity, of the purely dominant, of essentially being anything. There are two problems here. The first is that Foucault romanticized the Middle Ages. He wrote in his history of sexuality that homosexual as a noun was a modern invention. In the Middle Ages, sexual behavior and personal identity were separate categories. Foucault wasn't a medievalist, though, and someone must eventually have told him of Chaucer's treatment of the pardoner, or of the 14th century Palace gossip about the execution of Edward II, or about Marie de France's Lamballe, or et cetera, et cetera. In any case, in her later years, Foucault abandoned the claim. Dinshaw's use of Foucault is also the exoticizing impulse, the flip side of the Middle Ages as torture chamber for him, and Hay is a medievalist, so they ought to know that. The medieval becomes a haven, quoting Kipling again, a cleaner, greener land, an alternative to those gritty paving stones of urban America. Leaving aside the Middle Ages, Dinshaw's redefinition makes sense in theory. The world would probably be a much better place without its peremptory social firing systems, and it seems to work, at least sometimes, at least in the academic world. On the other hand, the Ving Rhames character might imply that Hay ain't playing, or that Hay's playing by your own rules for once, or that Hay's tired of abject roles and performances and has worked hard to become essentially something. If Hay did, we might disagree with your analysis or your methods, but our own analysis, however neatly theorized, would suffer if we assumed that Hay was trying to live by our moral values and not doing a very good job of it. The problem with most academic arguments about popular culture is that they're written from within a social class protected by centralized organized authority, and they tend to assume a morality that much of the world has become disenchanted with. This being America, class and race always come into it. What's an abjected space to academics is home to a lot of folks who don't feel abject and who don't feel like playing, or who feel like playing by their own rules for once. What's unregulated violence to those of us who are supported by regulated violence may seem like the only option to others. Medievalists have long complained that popular usage demoralizes the period, but it doesn't anymore. We've renamed the Renaissance the early modern period, claiming a lineage for the modern world. But the postmodern world is developing a different analysis. The Middle Ages are us now, and medievalists, like everybody else, will have to learn to live with that. Popular fiction images of the Middle Ages focus on personal trial as a training ground in times of crisis, when the central authority of the nation-state is absent or failed, and the world has gone local, without the Renaissance beliefs in statecraft and progress to hold it together. In Timeline and Black Knight, the uneasy linking of capitalism and chivalry is reflected into the modern world. And in Timeline in particular, the problem is that chivalric honor is a daydream with its own inner contradictions, and no real foothold as a moral force or political corrective. And yet these don't seem like apocalyptic or particularly dystopian works. They seem more like pedigrees, provenances, blueprints. In them, the Middle Ages are secondarily a source text for the present, but more important, they're an authority for the present. And when Marcellus Wallace says, "I'm going to get medieval on your ass," Hay's offering her own diagnosis of and response to modern America. The whole episode is practically personification, however. But Hay's also claimed for her actions moral authority grounded deep in Western civilization. Violence is American, is at the top. Maybe Hay wasn't born medieval. Hay's going to get medieval. Hay's going to play in an abjected space, adopt an abjected role, but in the process, he's going to create and legitimize a space where a term like abjected has no meaning. Sometimes getting medieval is a way of finding authority for the will to survive in the present crisis of instability and shifting boundaries. Sometimes what's authorized is Marcellus's revenge. Sometimes it's a neighborhood theme park. Sometimes it's Walmart. Sometimes it's the Occupy movement. Sometimes it's a portable home gym. In most of these projects, physical and psychological struggle is assumed either for the individual or for a local circle or cell or corporate entity in a world in crisis where central authority is non-existent, irrelevant, or obstructionist. The world has decided to get medieval on people's asses because getting Renaissance on them was a bad deal for most, and because getting medieval seems like a better deal at the moment. When the Euro-American world was Renaissance-centered, the medieval world was its deprived childhood. without modern science or progress or proper nation states to give it purpose and direction. But the Renaissance-centered world peaked in this country in the 1960s with the Cold War, dominant nation states playing chicken in each other's streets, the moon landing, and the myths of an expanding economy and an upwardly mobile population, all propelled by an endless supply of cheap oil. Those myths aren't compelling anymore. Without the Renaissance progress myth and the successful nation state as center, Noam Chomsky has pointed out that the U.S. is a failed state by its own definition. The U.S. of the early 21st century is looking for a new myth and a new source text, and there are signs that the medieval world is becoming that text. From where I stand, the prospect of a world gone local is appealing in some ways. It could include the values of the new urbanism and the green movement, and it would finally get the message of neighborhood control that the Black Panthers tried to send in the 1960s, and in a different way that Black Knight tries to send. On the other hand, again from my viewpoint, one problem, as the contradictions within timeline make clear, is that a world gone local is an invitation to baronial monopolism, which hardly needs an invitation to begin with. The capacity for unregulated violence in the present mood is also unappealing, and the promise of regulated violence in response is even less appealing. But these aren't future prospects, they're present reality, and we aren't well insulated from them. Academia is a fairly brittle fortress. So, what's a poor academic to do? We need to get out more, for one thing. We need to remember that our moral and ethical values and intellectual premises aren't inevitable. They reflect our positions in society. And we need to learn more about what our local institutions are doing to affect the world outside them and the people within them, including the people who mix the porridge and clean the moats. That's probably